Okay, folks, welcome. I think I'm recording this time. So I did this lecture last night about 5 o'clock, and at the end discovered that it hadn't been recording. So this is Monday morning now, and I apologise. I'm calling it a technical hitch, but really it's just ignorance on my part and unfamiliarity with using Zoom to record lectures. Anyway, we'll leap in now. If you like, this lecture's called to be distinctive. And if you like, that could also be the title for the sermon on Sunday morning, the call to be distinctive. And I challenge the whole notion of the new normal. So I think we'll leap straight in. On my previous recording, we did read the readings again that we had on Sunday, but I won't do that this time. I want to start by making the point that being a called people, called to be distinctive, and another word for that, of course, is holy, to be a holy people. God started that process with Abraham, way back in Genesis chapter 2. And Abraham, if you were watching, you should be very proud of this name that refers to the first person, the father of our faith, who was the one who was called to leave. He was called to leave what he had and the life that he had and the world that he was in. And he was called to follow what God had for him. And there's a great promise. We'll have a look at it in Genesis chapter 12 and from verse 1. The call to Abram. He was called Abram before he was Abraham, because Abram is just father. And Abraham adds the word nations, father to many nations. So you found it probably before me. I'm reading from the NIV, but read with me. It's cool. It's titled, and you know I don't like titles in Bibles because they're not part of the text, but the title here is The Call of Abram. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, very important. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. That's interesting, that one. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And we're going to talk about the journey of the people of Israel, Abraham's descendants, in terms of being a distinctive nation. Their calling was to be a distinctive people, a holy people. But that was only ever fulfilled, of course, through the coming of the Messiah, that through Abraham and his descendants, the world would be blessed. And that is only begun in the sending out that was one of Jesus' roles for the church being his followers. And through that sending out, the blessing to all nations began. And in fact, in the early days, went out so rapidly that most of the known world had heard of Christ by the end of 100 years. Then, obviously communication was different in those days, but we won't go down that path now. Suffice to say that right from the beginning, the people of God were a called people, called by God, chosen by God to live distinctive lives separate from, in the world but not of it, separate from the worlds to which they went. And the journey of Israel and God and that relationship was a roller coaster journey. They were called to be a holy people, distinctive and separate, and receiving the laws of Moses under Moses' leadership several centuries after Abraham, of course. It's for a while they were aligned with God's will and they were distinctive, and then they get grumbly in the wilderness, and then they go into the promised land and things are fine for a while, but then things dip as they start to ameliorate or mix in with, ameliorate's not the right word, integrate. It's syncretism, it's called, adopting the gods of the Canaanites and the Moabites and the Philistines. And this was the roller coaster ride of the story of Israel in the Old Testament. It's that journey of faithfulness and unfaithfulness, and their ability to remain a holy people and then forgetting about it and mixing it up and merging, assimilating with the cultures that were around them. And remember, when they came into the land of Canaan, it was not empty. There were people already residing there. We would call them Palestinians. And of course, that tension, that conflict is still ongoing to this day in the Holy Land, in the Promised Land. The Palestinian people saying, we've been here longer than you, or as long as you. How come you're laying claim to it all? And then there was all the skirmish leading up to the Second World War when the Jews were given Israel as a place to come to. And of course, many of them did, particularly after the Second World War. And so the journey of distinctiveness, the call to be distinctive for Israel in the Old Testament, is a roller coaster ride of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. And the whole role of the prophets was God sent the prophets to bring the people back to a loyalty and a faithfulness that saw them stand out as a distinctive nation, or not, as the case might be. We think of corrupt kings like King Ahab, whose wife was Jezebel, and have a look at that story, and I think it's 2 Samuel. Have a look at that story. It's a very colourful one where Elijah, the prophet called by God to try and bring the leadership of the nation back to being a holy and distinctive people. So that was kind of just a quick visit to what happened prior to the coming of Jesus. And Ezekiel, I mentioned Ezekiel 20 verse 32. We won't go there right now, but it's Ezekiel in a way mocking Israel for their unfaithfulness and saying, you want to be like the gods around you, don't you? You want to serve gods of wood and stone. And as Eugene Peterson's translation has something like, gods you can control. And that's an interesting concept when we come to our own age. And what are the gods that we are tempted to worship? What are the gods that are operating in New Zealand and Australia at this time? Are they not things that we like to be in control of, or at least kid ourselves that we're in control of? And of course, this whole coronavirus epidemic, or the pandemic, has shaken that. And maybe that's a good thing, has shaken our reliance on things that we thought we could control. Suddenly we're cast into a situation where we're not in control anymore. And it's very obvious that we're not in control anymore. Okay, so we'll move on here. I do have some notes that I'm hiding up here on the scene. I did spend a bit of time emphasizing this word metzuya, which in the Old Testament means distinct, and in modern Hebrew actually means outstanding. And it's interesting, the link between being distinct or special or holy and outstanding in the sense of standing out, not necessarily being excellent. But I think actually that is part of it. And there's no better witness that we can have in our communities than by being excellent outstanding in what we are called to do, whether we be travel agents or lawyers or teachers or students or mums and dads. I think there is a sense in which we should strive to be outstanding. There's no better witness, and you think of great sportsmen in New Zealand, people like Michael Jones, some of you will know who I mean. There's a wonderful athlete called, well, his name's just gone, Nick is his first name. He was in the Olympic team. He's getting on a bit, but he's a very, very good 1500 metre runner who's quite open about his Christian faith. Nick Willis is his name. Outstanding. And they are great examples of Christian faith. Anyway, again, I'm sidestepping a little bit, but this concept of metsuyan is good from the point of view that we should be standing out. There should be something distinctive about us if we're being faithful to Jesus' command to be salt and light. Salt and light. Salt brings flavor to whatever it is in. And you think of the Christian living in an office environment, in a business organization, or in a school staff room, or an early childhood, that their presence there should bring flavor and lovely color. Well, not so much color, but a seasoning to that environment. That should be an offshoot, not obnoxious, holier than thou piety that some Christians look down their noses at all the sinners around them. That's not what our calling is to be. Although, of course, the other aspect to salt is to be a preservative and a purifier. But that's something that happens sort of discreetly through our presence in the world and in organizations. All those things we'll talk about later on and on Tuesday night, particularly as you flesh this out for yourselves and apply these concepts in your own lives as salt and light. Another point I wanted to make about the Jewish people is that being distinctive has been costly for them. Orthodox Jews, those who adhere to the rules and regulations, there's a lot of regulations over food, there's regulations about not working on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, which is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. They stand out. Orthodox Jews stand out in a community, and that has drawn people's attention to them over the centuries. And there were persecutions going on way before, right throughout history, in fact, way before the pogrom in the Second World War in last century. Terrible things have happened to the Jewish people simply because they are the people of Israel, and they are distinctive, and they refuse to give in to the pressures to change and conform to the world around them. Now, no, most modern Jews, like modern Christians, we don't dress up like Mennonites, for instance, or wear monks' habits. But we do try and retain this distinctiveness. So the Jews, and I guess the Jews have been singled out. They're not the only ethnic group, of course, that have been singled out for being distinctive, but they are the one that probably is foremost in human history. So I guess the underlying caveat there is that if we are faithful to God in being his distinctive people, then we should expect that there will be times when we will be discriminated against and we will be persecuted. And you only have to think of people in countries like Nigeria, where increasingly there are Islamic forces on Christians and terrible things are happening to Christian communities in the northern areas in Nigeria where the Muslim faith is more prevalent. Northern Sudan is another country. Egypt, most Muslim countries, it's very hard to be a Christian and hold a Christian community together. China, to be publicly Christian in China, even though there's something like 300 million Christians in China, I understand it is still tough to publicly be a Christian. And as long as you are a government-sanctioned church, you're fine. But if you're anything different, then there's quite a lot of pressure politically and through their own military justice system on you. And numerous other nations. Indonesia, that many of you will have come from Indonesia listening to this lecture, and you could see how quickly things could change in your own country with the, I think it's, Indonesia is 85% Muslim. And I know in some areas in Indonesia, it's very, very hard to maintain Christian communities and a Christian presence. And so it's something that we should expect, that if we are being distinctive and standing out for God, then we will be identified and there will be times of pressure on us. Jesus said in Matthew 16:24, whoever wants to follow me must take up their cross and follow me, uncompromising following. And there is a character I do want to mention in terms of this distinctiveness costing him much, and that is the German theologian and pastor, minister, Protestant minister, who stood up against Adolf Hitler's teachings, his philosophy, the philosophy of the Third Reich. The war was looking like it was about to start, and Bonhoeffer was over in America lecturing, I think, in Harvard University. And people there were saying it's too dangerous for you to go back because you are known to oppose the teachings of the Third Reich, the Nazi philosophy. But Bonhoeffer felt called by God to return to his church and try and fight against, not physically, but try and resist and try and lead an opposition before the war broke out to Hitler's party and to their philosophy. And he eventually, during the war, was arrested because he continued to speak out. He said, what you're doing is not right. It's against God's laws. It's inconsistent with Christianity. And he was imprisoned, and eventually he was executed for his stand. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is someone who has had tremendous influence on so many Christians. And if you're into reading books and you can handle reading fairly complex books, he's written quite a few. And his most famous book is The Cost of Discipleship, that he wrote before he died. Okay. Next question I want to ask in relation to this is, so, there was Bonhoeffer trying to restore Christian integrity to a nation that called itself Christian, the German nation. And so I raised this question: to what extent are we called to restore and repair our world? Or should we just consider it to be lost and it's going to get wiped out anyway eventually, according to some, and according to some people's interpretation of Scripture? And usually it's those apocalyptic scriptures which are very hard to interpret, I must warn you, and there are all sorts of different views. Is our calling to just be focused on winning souls for Christ, just evangelism, and give up on the world? Or is our calling to be involved in the restoration and repair of our world that has gone astray and is not perfect? Far from it. Do Jesus' words, feed my sheep, at the end of Matthew's gospel mean only worry about the spiritual welfare of people? Or was he meaning literally feed the hungry? see that the hungry in the world have enough food and enough shelter and enough clean water. Now, in the history of the church, this is something that's become a polarizing thing. And even in our Presbyterian church, there are the more liberal Christians who would say, well, yes, we've got to get involved entirely in this is what our job on earth is to expend ourselves in trying to improve the world and free the oppressed, feed the hungry, and change the system so that it's a more fair system. And there's not a lot of spiritual component in that because of their particular theology. On the other hand, the other polar opposite is those Christians who believe, the time is short and you just got to get on with the business of spiritual transformation and winning souls for Christ. Many of us find ourselves, I used to talk about the two legs of the athlete that is the church. One is really committed to social justice, feeding the hungry, freeing the slaves from oppression. And the other leg of the athlete that is the church, and I once spoke to Presbytery about this about 30 years ago, is the spiritual dynamic, knowing and believing in God active in our world and transforming hearts and minds through spiritual renewal, metamorphosis that we talk about in Romans 2. We're going to get to that before we finish today. So anyway, there's some challenges for us to wrestle with. My view would be that it is both and. It is, yes, we are called. Jesus does call us to actually feed the hungry, care for the diseased, care for the disadvantaged, particularly care for those who are trapped in slavery and oppressed, and do something about it. At the same time as actually knowing that basically if there isn't spiritual transformation, then nothing will be lasting. And that ultimately it's the spiritual transformation of an individual and communities that is so important to God. And I'll leave that for further discussion on Tuesday night. One of the important areas that we need to also wrestle with is identifying the things in our world, our culture, that are the little g gods that people worship, philosophies and beliefs and practices. Bonhoeffer would say that only when we respond to Christ and follow his call do we become our real selves. In other words, until God finds us, we don't find ourselves. And in our society, it would seem that we've got things in reverse. Most people are unsure about God and the church, but they pretend to be sure about themselves, or at least wanting to control their own destinies. Leave me alone. The Kiwi mantra is, leave me alone. I can do it. I can fix anything. I'll find my own way. Don't bother me. And rather, in one of Bonhoeffer, one of his poems, he asks the question in each verse, who am I? Who am I? And then right at the end, he says, who am I? O God, I am thine. And there's this sense that until we have answered God's call or claim on our life and said, yes, we are yours, O God, only then will we start to discover who we truly are. But if we hang on to our lives and say, I can do this on my own, get away from me, leave me alone, I will determine my own destiny. And that's when we lose ourselves. And here is this confident mantra in our society, all these self-discovery processes and techniques. And we've got one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Okay, so to wind things up, we've got about 10 minutes left. I want us to have a closer look, and I haven't actually looked at any of the verses that I had actually in my notes, but we'll forge on. I want you to turn to Romans chapter 12, which was the end of our reading. And I deliberately had Michelle read those verses known as the doxology in chapter 11 of Paul's letter to the Romans. But we pick it up for the sake of this little lecture. We pick it up at verse 2. Oh, well, we might as well read verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And I would add, and you will find yourself. And the fulfillment of that obedience to God's call will become your reality. We're just going to focus on verse 2 of chapter 12 here, and I do want to draw out the meaning of a number of these words here in the original Greek text. Now, the first word is the word for do not be conformed to. All of those words in English are encapsulated in one long, I think it's got 12 letters. Sukematizeste. Yeah, that'd be a tricky one to remember for an exam, wouldn't it? This is only used here, and secondly in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. We won't go there today, but note that down. This word, do not be conformed to, is only found in 2 places in the Bible. Here with Paul in verse 2, and also in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. And it means do not model yourself after the pattern. Do not conform yourself to the pattern of the environment or the world around you, the life forces around you. Do not use anything out there as your role model, or any person out there other than Christ as your role model. Do not fashion yourself after these things. And again, if you think back to the Old Testament, that was the call of God through the prophets. Don't be attracted to the ways of the fertility gods that were in Mesopotamia, and the Canaanites and the Moabites and the Hittites and the Philistines. They all had these fancy religions. And we will talk on Tuesday night, and we haven't got time today to explore this, and I can't have a discussion with you, unfortunately, but I will be asking you, so what are these gods today that we need to be aware of? And I think you'll find, as I have found, that I've already inculcated some of these values and motivations and these patterns into the way I look at the world and the way I behave. And so the challenge here is from Paul, is to be careful of what we are conforming ourselves towards. Just briefly touch on the word for this world. Do not conform to this world, the pattern of this world. The word is aeoni, which is a bit like eon, era, period, epoch. This space and time. Do not, hang on, I'll just pause here a sec. I just had to halt the recording there for a sec. and it wasn't the earthquake that we had earlier this morning. Well, not here, but down south. I was talking about this word for the age or the world, era, this space and time, this culture, if you like, that we are in. It's not just thinking about the globe, as the earth, which is relevant to us to consider. It's the cultural mores around about us that Paul is talking about here. Now, the next word I want you to have a look at is not the word, but be transformed. Now, the Greek word here is metamorphosei. And if I was a little bit more confident, I'd get the whiteboard out, of course. Maybe I'll do that another time at another place. But of course, this is the word that's connected with our word metamorphosis or metamorphosis. The subject that I was most interested in at secondary school was biology. And I have clear memory of in our lab in about the fourth form at Glendowie College, we had these monarch butterfly caterpillars that after a few weeks turned into these beautiful green chrysalis that hung on a particular type of plant. And then after another few weeks, of course, the beautiful monarch butterfly, this process of metamorphosis. And it's a beautiful insight into the power of this word. The Paul is saying, but don't be conformed, don't be knocked about to and fro by this fashion and that fashion, but be transformed by God, by God's renewing spirit, transformational spirit. His presence in your life will transform you and enable you to be a distinctive salt and light in the environment, in the place that He has placed you. And the renewing of your mind is just the word nous, N-O-O-S. And that's what we get this, some of us use the word nous. Haven't you got any nous? In other words, don't you know anything about this? It's probably not something that you others would use. Barry would understand it, wouldn't you, Barry? Nous, to have nous. Dokimazen is the Greek word for test or approve. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is for you. And this again is the concept of a couple of weeks ago we were talking about the refiner's fire, and we are through this process we are tested and found to be pleasing to God. Agathon, good, and eureston, well pleasing, very acceptable. Not this word perfect, pleasing and perfect. The word perfect is a little bit misleading because we sort of think, oh, that's a goal that we will never achieve. But what it's actually meaning is that having reached your end in terms of being available and willing to do what God has called you to do and being distinctive, being His holy person, it is completed. It's not that the ongoing work of God's Spirit and sanctification isn't ongoing, but you have been able to break away from those forces of the world that seek to shape you and dim the light and dilute the saltiness. So that's just one verse kind of unlocked, and you can see how it applies to this call to be distinctive. And that's why that was at the heart of the readings that I had for you yesterday. So in terms of application, I would ask the questions, what will this look like in our lives? If we are able to be distinctive, if we are to be fully flavored salt with all its power, and light emanating out. What will that look like practically in our lives? What will that look like practically for St. Andrew's community, if you're part of that? This conglomeration of God's people we call St. Andrew's Presbyterian First Presbyterian Simon Street. What should we expect to see in our activity and our mission and what we do? We shouldn't see simply a group of people who meet together once a week for an hour and have a cup of tea afterwards. That's just like putting your hand into a bucket of water and turning it around and nothing changes. That's not our calling. Our calling is to be salt and light and to be outstanding or standing out. And I was serious when I nearly went down and talked to the owner of one of those bar bistros down at that quadrant of restaurants, down the bottom of town, about us. If the government insisted on stopping us from worshipping anymore, hire it out on a Sunday morning, go there and sit at our tables, tend to a table 2 meters apart and worship God and pray for the nation. That's the sort of thing we should be up for. Okay, and I guess the last question is, how does it happen? How does this happen? How do we enact that in our own lives individually and corporately in our church? So I'll leave you with those challenges. They're not my challenges, they're the challenges from God's word. And may God bless you as you wrestle with these things in your own personal study. And for some of us, we will meet on Tuesday night. And if you aren't part of that normal group, no normal, we're abnormal, we're outstanding, aren't we, people? Send me an email just to say, yep, I'm in, and I will send you an invite from about 7:15 tomorrow night. God bless. That's it. We're away.